At 8:30 in the morning on June 6, 1944, Lieutenant General Omar Bradley stood on the bridge of the heavy cruiser USS Augusta and watched the worst moment of his military career unfold before his eyes. 8 miles offshore, the sea was deceptively calm. The English Channel rolled gently beneath the steel hull of the ship, indifferent to the catastrophe taking place closer to the French coast. Through his binoculars, smeared with salt spray and smoke, Bradley could see Omaha Beach, or what remained of it. The invasion was dying. Landing craft burned at the waterline, their twisted metal silhouettes black against the pale sand. Bodies floated in the surf, rising and falling with the tide like debris after a storm. Others lay motionless on the beach itself, tangled among steel obstacles and shattered equipment. The men who had survived the landing were pinned down, hugging the sand behind hedgehogs and wooden stakes as German machine gun fire swept the shoreline without pause. The firing had begun before dawn. It had not stopped since. This was not how it was supposed to happen. Bradley had assured these men that naval bombardment would smash the German defenses before they ever touched French soil. Battleship guns, cruiser fire, and aerial bombing were meant to pulverize the bunkers overlooking Omaha Beach. He had told them they would face demoralized, second-rate troops, older men and foreign conscripts who would surrender once overwhelmed. The landing, he believed, would be hard but manageable. Now, barely hours into the assault, more than 2,000 American soldiers were already dead or dying. From the bridge of the Augusta, Bradley faced a decision that no invasion commander ever wanted to contemplate. The unthinkable began to take shape in his mind. Evacuation. Pull the survivors off Omaha Beach. Redirect the follow-up waves to Utah Beach to the west or to the British sector at Gold. Admit that the American assault had failed before it had truly begun. History often remembers D-Day as inevitable, as a triumph written in advance. On that morning, nothing felt inevitable. The margin between victory and disaster was thin, and Omaha Beach appeared to be slipping into catastrophe. What Bradley could not see from his distant vantage point was the full truth of what was happening on the sand. He could not see that entire companies had been shattered within minutes of landing. He could not see men drowning under the weight of their gear before they ever fired a shot. He could not hear the screams, the shouted orders swallowed by gunfire, the desperate prayers whispered into the sand. From 8 miles offshore, Omaha looked like a battlefield already lost. The irony was cruel. The largest amphibious assault in history had been built on confidence. Confidence in planning, confidence in firepower, confidence in numbers. Yet the reality unfolding below exposed how fragile those assumptions were. Bombers had missed their targets. Naval gunfire had been too brief. Tanks meant to support the infantry lay at the bottom of the English Channel. And the German defenders, far from being shattered, were fully intact, firing with deadly precision from prepared positions. Bradley watched the beach through his binoculars, knowing that every second of hesitation meant more men dying in the surf. He was not a reckless commander. He was cautious by nature, methodical, deeply aware of the cost of failure. Unlike some generals, Bradley felt responsibility not as abstraction but as weight. Those men on the beach were not numbers to him. They were Americans he had sent into combat based on promises that were now broken. The situation reports arriving aboard the Augusta only reinforced his fears. Communications were fragmented, incomplete, often contradictory. Units were pinned down. Officers were dead. Progress inland was measured not in miles, but in yards, sometimes only a few feet. The beachhead was not forming. The invasion timetable was collapsing. For the first time since the planning for Operation Overlord began, the possibility of outright failure became real. This moment, though rarely emphasized in popular memory, mattered profoundly. Had Bradley ordered evacuation, history would have taken a very different course. The Allied invasion might have been delayed for months, perhaps longer. German forces would have redeployed. Hitler's belief that the main invasion would come elsewhere might have been vindicated. The cost of trying again could have been even higher. Standing on the bridge of the Augusta, Bradley was not thinking about legacy or history books. He was thinking about the men dying in front of him and the responsibility that came with command. To continue feeding troops into what looked like a slaughterhouse seemed irresponsible. To pull them out risked chaos, humiliation, and strategic disaster. The invasion was hanging by a thread. What Bradley did not know, what no one on the Augusta could yet understand, was that the battle for Omaha Beach was already changing. Somewhere in the smoke and confusion, amid the bodies and burning wreckage, small groups of American soldiers were beginning to move. Not because the plan demanded it, but because staying still meant death. Sergeants were taking charge. Lieutenants were rallying survivors. Men were making decisions without orders, driven by instinct and desperation. And among them, walking upright through machine gun fire, was a 51-year-old general with a bad heart and a walking cane who would soon change the fate of Omaha Beach, and with it, the fate of the invasion itself. At 8:30 that morning, Bradley could not see that yet. All he could see was failure. And as the minutes passed, the decision before him grew heavier with every life lost on the sand below. The disaster unfolding on Omaha Beach was not the result of a single failure. It was the cumulative weight of assumptions that had collapsed under fire. Every major promise made to the men landing that morning, about fire support, enemy strength, and tactical conditions, had proven false within minutes. The first promise to fail was the bombardment. The invasion plan rested heavily on air power. Thousands of heavy bombers were tasked with softening the beach defenses before the infantry arrived. Their bombs were supposed to crater the sand, destroy German bunkers, and cut wire obstacles to pieces. Those craters would provide shelter for advancing troops. The bunkers would be reduced to rubble. The beach would be stunned, disoriented, and survivable. Instead, cloud cover on the morning of June 6 forced bomber crews to delay their release. Pilots had been ordered to avoid hitting Allied ships at all costs. In the few seconds they waited, the bombers traveled farther inland. When the bombs finally fell, they landed not on Omaha Beach, but in the empty fields beyond it. The German defenses emerged virtually untouched. The men coming ashore would find no craters, no cover, no shattered bunkers. Naval gunfire was supposed to compensate. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers had the firepower to crush concrete fortifications. Some officers argued that naval bombardment should last for hours. Rear Admiral John Hall was among them. He believed sustained fire was essential to suppress German positions long enough for the infantry to establish a foothold. He was overruled. The naval bombardment at Omaha lasted just 40 minutes. It was precise, disciplined, and far too brief. Many bunkers survived intact. German machine gun nests remained operational. Mortar teams waited calmly for the landing craft to approach. When the bombardment lifted, the defenders were ready. Hall would later say, "It is a crime to send me on the biggest amphibious attack in history with such inadequate naval gunfire support." Events proved him right. Then there were the tanks. The plan called for amphibious Sherman tanks, DD tanks, to land with the first wave and provide mobile fire support. These tanks were meant to suppress machine gun positions and give infantry something solid to rally behind. On paper, it was an elegant solution. Reality was harsher. The English Channel that morning was rough. 5-foot swells battered the fragile canvas flotation screens that kept the tanks afloat. In the eastern sector of Omaha Beach, 29 tanks were launched. 27 of them sank. Their crews drowned inside steel hulls that never reached the shore. In the western sector, a tank commander made a critical decision. He refused to launch his tanks offshore and ordered them landed directly on the beach. His tanks survived. His judgment saved lives. Most of Omaha was not so fortunate. When American infantry hit the sand, they did so without armor, without effective air cover, and without the expected suppression of German defenses. The beach they encountered bore no resemblance to the one described in briefings. And the enemy was not who they had been told to expect. Army intelligence believed Omaha Beach was defended primarily by the German 716th Static Infantry Division. These troops were described as second-rate, older men, wounded veterans, and foreign conscripts considered unfit for service on the Eastern Front. Planners expected them to break under pressure. What they did not know was that the German 352nd Infantry Division had moved into the area months earlier. This was not a static unit. The 352nd was composed of younger soldiers, experienced officers, and hardened non-commissioned leaders, many of them veterans of the Eastern Front. They were well-equipped, disciplined, and fully capable of executing a sophisticated defense. Their positions had been carefully prepared. Their fields of fire overlapped with lethal precision. They had registered their weapons on the waterline. When the landing craft ramps dropped, the German machine gunners knew exactly where to fire. The intelligence failure was catastrophic. The Americans were attacking a far stronger enemy than expected, one prepared not just to resist, but to annihilate an assault force. Every element of the plan that depended on timing now collapsed. Units landed in the wrong places. Officers died before issuing orders. Equipment sank or burned. The careful synchronization between infantry, armor, air, and naval fire disintegrated in minutes. This was not incompetence. It was the brutal reality of modern warfare colliding with imperfect information. Planning for Operation Overlord had been exhaustive. The Allies had studied tides, weather patterns, beach gradients, and enemy defenses in extraordinary detail. But no plan survives first contact with the enemy. At Omaha Beach, the plan did not merely bend, it shattered. For the men pinned down on the sand, the consequences were immediate and deadly. German machine guns swept the beach in steady arcs. Mortars fell with precision. Artillery from the bluffs added to the chaos. Soldiers clung to obstacles meant to destroy landing craft, using them as the only available cover. The bombing craters that were supposed to protect them did not exist. Entire companies were erased within minutes. Company A of the 116th Infantry Regiment landed directly in front of a German strongpoint. Within 10 minutes, 96% of the company were casualties. Of more than 200 men, fewer than 20 reached the seawall alive. These were not isolated tragedies. They were the predictable outcome of assumptions that had failed. From offshore, Omaha Beach looked like an impossible problem. From the sand, it was worse. There was no clear way forward, no clear command structure, no clear hope. And yet, even as the promises of planning collapsed, something else began to take their place. Not doctrine, not schedules, not timetables, human decision. Men began to realize that the plan was dead, and that survival depended on doing something entirely different. What replaced the broken promises of bombardment and intelligence was improvisation, courage, and leadership at the smallest levels. The invasion was no longer being fought by maps and orders. It was being fought by individuals making life-or-death choices under fire. Omaha Beach had become a test not of planning, but of will. Long before the first landing craft touched the beaches of Normandy, doubt had already taken root among Britain's senior commanders. It was not doubt about courage, nor about commitment to the Allied cause. It was doubt born of memory, memories of earlier amphibious disasters that had ended in blood and failure. British officers did not need to imagine what could go wrong. They had seen it. In 1915, at Gallipoli, an Allied landing had descended into catastrophe. Poor intelligence, underestimated defenses, and rigid planning had trapped thousands of men on hostile shores. The lessons of that failure were carved deeply into British military thinking. Amphibious assaults, many believed, were among the most dangerous operations imaginable. Then came Dieppe. In August 1942, British and Canadian forces assaulted the French port of Dieppe in a limited raid meant to test German coastal defenses. The result was devastating. German guns dominated the beach. Tanks were destroyed almost immediately. Infantry were pinned down with nowhere to go. Of the 6,000 men who landed, over half were killed, wounded, or captured. The beach was littered with wreckage, and with proof that frontal assaults against fortified coasts could be suicidal. For many British commanders, Dieppe was not merely a failed raid. It was a warning. So when the Americans began pushing for a massive cross-channel invasion in 1944, British skepticism was immediate and intense. The concept itself was not new. What troubled them was its scale, and the confidence with which it was presented. The Americans believed technology and overwhelming firepower could solve problems that had defeated earlier generations. Air superiority, naval bombardment, specialized landing craft, and airborne operations would, they argued, neutralize the risks that haunted Gallipoli and Dieppe. British commanders were not convinced. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery supported the invasion, but only after demanding sweeping changes. He insisted on expanding the invasion front, increasing the number of divisions landing on the first day, and strengthening the follow-up forces. In his view, a narrow landing would invite disaster. If the Germans contained the beachhead early, the invasion could be crushed before it had a chance to grow. Montgomery's demands delayed the invasion by months, but they likely saved it. Others were more openly doubtful. Admiral Sir Bertram Ramsay, responsible for naval operations, worried about the vulnerability of landing craft and supply lines. General Alan Brooke, chief of the Imperial General Staff, privately recorded deep concerns in his diary. He feared that a failed invasion could cripple Allied morale and prolong the war indefinitely. To many British planners, the Americans seemed dangerously optimistic. This difference in outlook was shaped by experience. Britain had been at war since 1939. Its army had suffered defeat in France, evacuation at Dunkirk, disaster in Greece, and near collapse in North Africa. Survival had demanded caution. The Americans, by contrast, had entered the war later and with enormous industrial strength. They were accustomed to solving problems with scale and momentum. Neither approach was wrong, but the tension between them shaped every aspect of D-Day planning. Nowhere was British caution more visible than in the emphasis on deception and preparation. Operation Fortitude, the elaborate plan to mislead the Germans about the invasion location, reflected a deeply British understanding of strategic patience. Dummy armies, fake radio traffic, and false intelligence convinced German command that the main invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. This deception bought the Allies precious time. Even after D-Day began, German reserves remained frozen in place, waiting for an invasion that never came. British skepticism also influenced the design of specialized equipment. Remembering Dieppe, British engineers developed the so-called Hobart's Funnies, unusual armored vehicles designed to overcome beach obstacles. Mine-clearing tanks, bridge-laying vehicles, flamethrower tanks, and amphibious armor were all intended to solve specific problems that had proven deadly before. On the British and Canadian beaches, these innovations made a dramatic difference. Casualties were heavy, but objectives were largely achieved. The landings moved forward. At Omaha Beach, where many of these vehicles were absent or lost early, the contrast was stark. Yet even among skeptics, there was acceptance that the invasion had to be attempted. Britain could not defeat Germany alone. The Soviet Union was bearing the brunt of the war in the East. Opening a second front was not just strategic. It was essential. The question was not whether to invade, but whether the invasion could succeed. As June 1944 approached, doubts did not vanish. They were simply set aside. The planning had gone as far as it could. The preparations were massive. The deception had worked. Weather windows were narrowing. Delay carried its own risk. When Eisenhower made the final decision to go, British commanders accepted it with professionalism, not certainty. On the eve of the invasion, some officers privately believed the beaches would run red with blood. They feared that Dieppe would repeat itself on a terrifying scale. Others believed the Allies had finally learned enough to break the pattern of failure. D-Day would answer that question. The skepticism of British commanders was not weakness. It was caution forged by experience. It forced improvements, delays, and adaptations that made the invasion stronger. It challenged American optimism and demanded proof rather than faith. When the invasion came, success would not belong to one nation's philosophy over another's. It would be the result of tension between confidence and doubt, speed and caution, innovation and memory. And on the beaches of Normandy, history would judge which lessons mattered most. Before a single soldier stepped onto the beaches of Normandy, the greatest battle of D-Day was already being fought inside Allied headquarters. It was not a battle of weapons or terrain, but of ideas. Two different ways of war stood face to face, each shaped by history, experience, and survival. On one side stood Britain. For Britain, the war had begun early and nearly ended just as fast. The collapse of France in 1940, the evacuation at Dunkirk, the loss of Singapore, and years of fighting from a position of weakness had taught one lesson above all others: avoid unnecessary risk. Britain could not afford catastrophic failure. Its army was smaller, its manpower limited. Every defeat carried existential consequences. British strategy favored caution, preparation, and gradual pressure. Peripheral campaigns in North Africa, Italy, and the Mediterranean reflected this thinking. Wear the enemy down. Control the seas. Use air power. Strike where Germany was weakest. Avoid a direct confrontation until conditions were overwhelming. This was not cowardice. It was survival. On the other side stood the United States. America entered the war late but with immense strength. Its factories produced ships, tanks, aircraft, and ammunition on a scale the world had never seen. American commanders believed that wars were won by decisive action, by concentrating power and smashing the enemy at the heart of his strength. Delay, in their view, only prolonged suffering and gave the enemy time to adapt. General George Marshall, the U.S. Army Chief of Staff, was the clearest voice of this philosophy. From the beginning, he argued for a direct cross-channel invasion. One massive blow. One clear objective. Defeat Germany in France and drive straight toward Berlin. To British ears, this sounded dangerously simplistic. The disagreement was not merely academic. It shaped the entire direction of the war. For years, Britain resisted American pressure for an early invasion of France. Instead, Allied forces fought in North Africa, then Italy. To Americans, these campaigns felt like detours, costly operations that delayed the decisive battle. British leaders saw them differently. Each campaign weakened Germany, stretched its resources, and gained experience. Every month bought time to prepare for the one operation that truly mattered. The tension between these approaches reached its peak at the highest political level. Winston Churchill feared another slaughter like the Somme or Passchendaele. He preferred what he called the soft underbelly of Europe, striking around the edges rather than through fortified northern France. He worried that a failed invasion would shatter Allied unity and hand Germany a strategic victory. Franklin Roosevelt, balancing alliance politics and domestic pressure, leaned increasingly toward the American view. The United States could not remain indefinitely tied down by secondary operations. The public expected result. The Soviet Union demanded a second front. At the Tehran Conference in late 1943, the issue came to a head. Joseph Stalin, whose armies were bleeding on the Eastern Front, had little patience for delay. He demanded a firm commitment to invade Western Europe. Under that pressure, the decision became unavoidable. Operation Overlord would go ahead. Yet agreement on when did not mean agreement on how. British planners insisted on longer preparation, broader landings, and overwhelming support. American planners pushed for speed and momentum. Every compromise reflected the clash between these philosophies. Even the structure of the invasion reflected this tension. The Americans would land on Omaha and Utah, facing some of the strongest defenses. The British and Canadians would land on Gold, Juno, and Sword, with extensive specialized equipment designed to neutralize obstacles. The plan looked unified on paper. In reality, it was a careful balancing act. This philosophical divide also shaped command styles. British officers tended to emphasize control, coordination, and adherence to plan. American officers placed greater trust in initiative, improvisation, and aggressive leadership at lower levels. No one yet knew which approach would prove decisive under fire. As the invasion approached, this tension did not disappear. It became sharper. Weather delays tested patience. Logistical challenges multiplied. Intelligence remained incomplete. Yet the machinery kept moving forward, driven by momentum as much as consensus. On the night of June 5, 1944, Allied commanders watched the Armada depart knowing that no plan could survive first contact with the enemy. The question was not whether the plan was perfect. It was whether the men executing it could adapt faster than the Germans could react. At dawn, that question would be answered not in conference rooms, but on beaches under fire. At Omaha, where American forces landed into a storm of bullets and chaos, the clash of philosophies became brutally real. The careful planning collapsed within minutes. Units were shattered. Leaders were killed. Communication failed. And yet, in that collapse, the American way of war revealed its strength. Small groups acted without orders. Sergeants became commanders. Privates made decisions meant for officers. There was no grand maneuver, only forward movement, inch by inch, driven by individual will. At the same time, the British emphasis on preparation showed its value elsewhere. On their beaches, specialized armor cleared mines, bridged obstacles, and suppressed defenses. Progress was steadier. Losses were heavy but controlled. The invasion did not succeed because one philosophy was superior to the other. It succeeded because both were present. British caution prevented disaster. American aggression prevented paralysis. Together, they formed a system resilient enough to survive chaos. D-Day proved that modern warfare required more than plans or courage alone. It required flexibility, an ability to absorb failure and continue forward. The Allied victory in Normandy was not the triumph of a single doctrine, but the uneasy fusion of two. And on the beaches of France, that fusion was tested in blood. The plan for Omaha Beach was precise, detailed, and confident. On paper, it was supposed to work. Naval guns would smash German defenses. Bombers would soften the cliff. Amphibious tanks would swim ashore ahead of the infantry. Engineers would clear obstacles. Within hours, American forces would be moving inland. None of it happened as planned. At dawn on June 6, 1944, the sea itself turned against the invasion. Strong currents pushed landing craft off course. Waves slammed into the fragile DD tanks, the very machines meant to give infantry armored support. One by one, they sank. Out of the dozens launched offshore, only a handful reached the beach. When the first infantry ramps dropped, American soldiers stepped not into a suppressed battlefield, but into a killing zone. German defenses were intact. The preliminary bombing had failed. Cloud cover forced bombers to release their loads too late, far inland. The naval bombardment, shortened to avoid hitting the landing craft, had barely scratched the bunkers carved into the cliff. German machine guns and artillery were waiting, fully manned, fully supplied, and perfectly positioned. The men of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions were immediately pinned down. Bullets ripped through the surf. Mortar rounds exploded among tightly packed troops. Bodies floated in the water, dragged under by the weight of soaked equipment. Radios were destroyed. Officers were killed within minutes. The chain of command shattered almost instantly. Companies that had trained together for months landed scattered across miles of beach. Some units lost over half their men before reaching dry sand. Others never made it off the waterline at all. The beach filled with wounded men who could not move forward or back. There was no cover. Only a narrow strip of shingle and sand lay between the sea and the bluff. German fire swept it end to end. Engineers tasked with clearing obstacles were cut down before they could work. Explosives detonated prematurely. Timetables collapsed. Follow-on waves landed directly into the chaos, piling men and equipment into an already lethal space. Within the first hour, the invasion plan at Omaha Beach was effectively dead. From offshore, it looked even worse. General Omar Bradley watched the carnage through binoculars from the bridge of his flagship. Reports were fragmentary and grim. Casualties were mounting. Tanks were gone. Engineers were failing. No clear breakthroughs were reported anywhere along the beach. For the first time on D-Day, the word evacuation was quietly discussed. This was the nightmare British planners had feared. A frontal assault stalled on the sand, men trapped under fire, unable to advance or withdraw. The beach threatened to become another Dieppe, only on a much larger scale. Yet within the chaos, something unexpected began to happen. Small groups of men, often led by junior officers or non-commissioned officers, began to move. Without orders, without coordination, they crawled, ran, and fought their way toward the base of the bluffs. They used shell craters, wreckage, and the bodies of fallen comrades for cover. The invasion plan was gone, but the invasion itself was not. German defenses, while strong, were not infinite. Ammunition was limited. Fields of fire overlapped, but they also created blind spots. The bunkers were formidable, but once bypassed, they were vulnerable from behind. American soldiers began exploiting these weaknesses instinctively. One machine gun nest would be silenced by grenades, another by rifle fire from an unexpected angle. A single breach in the wire allowed a handful of men through. That handful became dozens. Dozens became a foothold. None of this was in the plan. By mid-morning, isolated breakthroughs began to appear along the bluff. They were small, fragile, and disorganized, but they existed. German defenders, expecting a coordinated assault, now faced enemies appearing from places they thought impassable. The battlefield shifted from a scripted landing to a series of brutal, close-range fights. Offshore, the situation was reassessed. Naval commanders realized that if they did not act, the beach might still fail. Destroyers were ordered to move dangerously close to shore. So close that they risked grounding or being hit by coastal guns. They opened fire at point-blank range. Shells screamed over the heads of American infantry and slammed directly into German positions. Gun barrels overheated. Ammunition ran low. But bunker after bunker was smashed or suppressed. This naval intervention changed everything. With German fire weakened, more infantry pushed forward. By early afternoon, American forces were finally moving off the beach in multiple locations. The landings had cost thousands of casualties, but Omaha was no longer collapsing. The plan had failed, but the men had not. Omaha Beach was taken not by doctrine or schedules, but by individual courage and improvisation. It was seized by soldiers who refused to accept that the mission was impossible, even when every sign pointed to disaster. By nightfall, the beachhead was shallow and fragile, but it existed. The Germans had failed to throw the Americans back into the sea. What had begun as near-total failure had become a costly success. And in that transformation lay the true lesson of Omaha Beach. Plans can collapse in minutes, but determination, once unleashed, can still change history. For the men trapped on Omaha Beach, there was no sense of time, only survival. Minutes stretched into hours as waves of gunfire tore across the sand. The tide crept in slowly, relentlessly, erasing what little space the soldiers had to cling to. They were pinned between two forces that showed no mercy, the sea behind them and German fire in front. Many men had lost their weapons in the surf. Others had watched radios shatter, flamethrowers explode, and demolition charges disappear beneath the waves. Heavy packs dragged wounded soldiers under. Some drowned only yards from safety, their strength gone before they ever faced the enemy. The beach itself offered almost no protection. A low shingle bank ran along the shore, but it was hardly cover, only concealment. Bullets snapped overhead, striking sand, stone, and flesh with equal ease. Mortar rounds rained down without warning, scattering bodies and equipment in every direction. Men hugged the ground not out of fear alone, but because standing meant death. Leadership evaporated in the opening minute. Platoon leaders were killed or wounded. Company commanders vanished into smoke and confusion. Orders, if they existed, could not be heard over the roar of gunfire and crashing waves. Some units lost 90% of their officers before they had fired a single shot. What remained were groups of men, sometimes only 5 or 6, pressed together by circumstance rather than design. Rank mattered less than resolve. Whoever could move, whoever could shout above the noise, whoever could point forward and say, "This way," became a leader. The wounded lay everywhere. Medics crawled under fire, dragging men behind obstacles that barely qualified as cover. Morphine syrettes were used until supplies ran out. Some soldiers lay bleeding for hours, unable to move, staring at the sky and wondering if the next wave would finish them. The tide rose. Equipment that had offered protection moments earlier became trapped. Vehicles flooded. Bodies drifted. The sea claimed men who could no longer crawl fast enough. For some, the only choice was to move forward, or be swallowed by the water. The psychological strain was immense. Men who had trained for months now found themselves paralyzed by the sheer scale of the chaos. The plan they had memorized was useless. The landmarks they were supposed to recognize were gone. Smoke obscured the cliff. Every direction looked the same. Some froze. Others snapped out of it violently, driven by adrenaline and instinct. They ran when running seemed impossible. They crawled toward gunfire instead of away from it. Survival demanded motion. German defenders watched from above, confident at first. Their fields of fire were well prepared. Every approach had been mapped and rehearsed. But the chaos on the beach created something they had not anticipated: unpredictability. American soldiers did not attack in neat formations. They moved in fragments, appearing where they should not have been able to reach. A single man with a rifle became a threat if he reached the right angle. A grenade thrown from below could silence a machine gun that had dominated the beach for hours. Slowly, almost invisibly, the balance began to shift. It did not feel like progress to the men on the sand. Every yard forward was paid for in blood. But each movement reduced the pressure on those behind. Each suppressed gun opened space for another group to move. Offshore, commanders still feared disaster. Casualty reports were staggering. Communications were unreliable. Some believed the invasion was failing. On the beach, no one thought about failure or success. They thought about the next few seconds. A corporal might gather 3 men and crawl toward a breach in the wire. A sergeant might lead a rush up a narrow draw under machine gun fire. A private might pick up a fallen officer's weapon and keep going without a word. These were not heroic moments in the traditional sense. They were desperate, ugly, and terrifying. But they worked. By late morning, small clusters of Americans reached the base of the bluff. There, in dead ground beneath German positions, they caught their breath. From that point forward, retreat was impossible. The only way out was up. The climb was brutal. Loose soil gave way underboot. Bullets cracked overhead. Grenades rolled back down the slope. Men hauled each other upward, sometimes without knowing names, sometimes without knowing if the man beside them was alive. When they reached the top, the fight changed. German defenders now faced enemies at close range, emerging from directions they had not planned for. Bunkers designed to fire outward were vulnerable from behind. Trenches became death traps. One position fell, then another. Back on the beach, the effect was immediate. Fire slackened. Gaps opened. More men moved forward. What had been a killing ground slowly became a pathway inland. Omaha Beach was not saved by a single decision or a sudden breakthrough. It was saved by endurance, by men who refused to stay pinned between sea and death. They moved because staying still meant dying. And in that movement the invasion found its footing. By mid-morning on Omaha Beach, the invasion hung by a thread. The beach was still choked with wounded men, wrecked landing craft, and shattered units. Smoke drifted across the sand in thick curtains. German fire, though weakening in places, still dominated much of the shoreline. It was into this chaos that Brigadier General Norman, Dutch, Cotta came ashore. Cotta was not a young man. At 51, he had already spent decades in uniform. He had studied war, taught it, and argued about it long before most of the men around him were old enough to shave. He had also been openly skeptical of the Omaha landing plan from the start. He believed the daylight assault was too exposed, too optimistic, too dependent on perfect timing. Now, stepping onto the beach under fire, he saw his fears confirmed. Bullets snapped around him as he moved forward without hesitation. Unlike many officers, Cotta did not crouch low or search for cover. He walked upright, deliberately, as if refusing to acknowledge the danger. Men later said that watching him stand while they lay pinned to the sand was almost shocking. It forced them to look up. Cotta quickly grasped the situation. There was no central command left on the beach. Radios were dead. Units were mixed beyond recognition. Orders were meaningless unless they could be seen and heard. So Cotta led by presence. He moved among the men, shouting, pointing, demanding action. He kicked at soldiers hugging the shingle, telling them that staying where they were meant certain death. The sea was rising. The beach was a trap. Forward was the only option. As he reached a group of pinned-down Rangers near the seawall, Cotta recognized both the opportunity and the danger. These were trained assault troops, stalled not by lack of courage, but by overwhelming fire. German wire blocked their path. Machine guns swept the draws. Cotta did not deliver a speech. He delivered an order. Rangers, lead the way. The words were simple, but they cut through the chaos. The Rangers responded immediately. Bangalore torpedoes were brought forward. Long tubes packed with explosives meant to blast through wire obstacles. Under fire, they shoved the torpedoes into the German defenses. The first attempt failed. The lead Ranger was shot before the charge could be detonated. For a moment, everything froze. Cotta did not. He moved forward himself, stepping into the open, crossing the wire breach as bullets snapped around him. That single act shattered the paralysis. If a general could walk forward, then so could everyone else. The Rangers followed. The explosion tore open the wire. Men poured through the gap, scrambling up the slope beyond the seawall. German fire intensified, but it was no longer enough. Momentum had shifted. Cotta continued pushing inland, gathering men as he went. Rangers, infantry, engineers, anyone who could move. Rank no longer mattered. Direction did. What made Cotta's leadership decisive was not authority, but clarity. He did not attempt to restore the original plan. He did not wait for coordination or confirmation. He focused on the only objective that mattered: get off the beach. Every minute spent on the sand cost lives. Every yard forward reduced German control. As small groups reached higher ground, they began attacking German positions from unexpected angles. Trenches were cleared. Bunkers were assaulted from the rear. The defensive system that had seemed invincible from the beach began to unravel. Cotta's influence spread far beyond his immediate position. Word passed along the beach that a general was moving forward under fire, that breakthroughs were happening, that the beach was no longer lost. Morale shifted. Men who had been frozen by fear found reason to move. Those already advancing found confirmation that their instinct was right. Leadership, which had vanished in the opening minutes, reappeared in fragments, wherever someone was willing to stand up and go first. By early afternoon, American forces had secured multiple exits off Omaha Beach. The ground gained was limited, the losses enormous, but the foothold was real. Norman Cotta did not single-handedly save Omaha Beach. No one man could. But his actions at a critical moment helped transform chaos into movement, fear into momentum. Later, when asked about that day, Cotta spoke little of heroism. He spoke of necessity, of understanding that in battle, Hesitation is often deadlier than enemy fire. Omaha Beach did not fall because of perfect planning or superior weapons. It held because men like Kota refused to accept paralysis. They chose motion. And in that choice, the invasion lived. By the time the Rangers began to move, Omaha Beach had already earned its reputation as the most brutal landing zone of D-Day. The sand was littered with wreckage and bodies. Smoke hung low, mixing with the smell of salt water, cordite, and burning fuel. What had begun as a coordinated assault had collapsed into chaos, but now, out of that chaos, something dangerous was forming. Momentum. The U.S. Army Rangers were trained for moments like this, even if they had never imagined one so violent. Pinned down at the base of the seawall, they had watched men die by the dozens while German fire raked the beach. Their orders had been clear before landing. Now, those orders were irrelevant. Survival demanded initiative. When Norman Kota gave the command, "Rangers, lead the way," it was not a slogan. It was a challenge. The Rangers responded instantly. Bangalore torpedoes were dragged forward under fire. These awkward steel tubes, packed with explosives, were designed to be pushed beneath barbed wire obstacles and detonated to create narrow paths forward. Using them required calm hands and steady nerves. Luxuries in short supply on Omaha Beach. The first attempt nearly failed. The lead ranger was hit before he could complete the placement. He fell forward, collapsing against the wire. For a brief, terrifying moment, the attack stalled again. German machine guns intensified their fire, sensing movement. Then the torpedo detonated. The explosion tore a hole through the wire, sending fragments flying into the air. It was not a wide breach, but it was enough. One by one, Rangers poured through the gap, scrambling up the slope beyond the seawall. German defenders were caught off guard. Their defenses were designed to stop mass assaults from the beach, not small, aggressive groups climbing through gaps under smoke and fire. The Rangers moved fast, using grenades, rifles, and sheer aggression to silence positions one at a time. Every bunker neutralized reduced pressure on the beach below. Other units saw it happening. Infantrymen who had been pinned down for hours now had proof that movement was possible. They followed the Rangers' example, forming ad hoc groups and pushing toward the bluffs wherever a path appeared. The invasion plan was gone, but the battle was no longer static. This was the turning point. German resistance, once coordinated and crushing, began to fracture. Communication between bunkers broke down. Ammunition ran low. Fields of fire overlapped less effectively as American troops appeared behind and beside positions that had only been prepared to fire forward. What the Germans now faced was not an invasion force, but dozens of independent assaults. Close combat replaced distant slaughter. Grenades were thrown into trenches. Rifle fire echoed in confined spaces. Orders were shouted face to face instead of over radios. The defenders fought hard, but the psychological balance had shifted. They were no longer certain the beach could be held. Naval gunfire intensified as destroyers crept dangerously close to shore. Their shells struck cliffside positions with terrifying accuracy. Each hit shook the ground beneath both attacker and defender. By early afternoon, the phrase, "Rangers lead the way," was no longer just a motto. It described the reality unfolding across Omaha Beach. The breakthrough was not a single dramatic moment. It was a series of small victories, each one barely noticeable on its own, but devastating in combination. A bunker destroyed, a trench cleared, a draw opened. Together they created space. By late afternoon, American forces were firmly established above the beach in several sectors. The foothold was shallow, disorganized, and costly, but it existed. Omaha Beach had not been thrown back into the sea. The price had been enormous. Thousands lay dead or wounded. Units were shattered. Equipment was lost. Yet the impossible had been done. The strongest beach defenses in Normandy had been breached, not by flawless execution, but by determination under fire. Omaha Beach would forever be remembered as the place where the invasion nearly failed, and where it survived anyway. Not because the plan worked, but because the men did. December 24, 1944. The Ardennes forest lay shrouded in an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional snap of a frozen branch underfoot. Snow fell in fine, relentless flakes, coating the ground in a pristine white that betrayed nothing of the chaos beneath. American soldiers moved cautiously through the dense thickets, their breath visible in the frigid air, rifles held tight, eyes scanning for movement. The Germans had launched a sudden offensive, and every sound seemed amplified in the stillness, every shadow a potential threat. Lieutenant Harris led his squad along a narrow path, their boots sinking slightly into the snow with each step. The men were tense but resolute. Weeks of preparation and prior engagements had steeled them for the brutal winter warfare ahead. Around them, trees towered like frozen sentinels, branches heavy with snow, occasionally shedding a curtain of ice that rattled like distant gunfire. The morning light filtered through the canopy, casting long, gray shadows across the snow, creating illusions of figures where none existed. Harris signaled for a halt, crouching behind a fallen log, the cold biting through his glove. He scanned the horizon, spotting faint tracks leading off the path. "German patrol," he whispered, and his men froze, blending seamlessly with the landscape. Every detail mattered now. The enemy could be anywhere, and one misstep could be fatal. The squad adjusted their formation, spreading slightly to cover more ground, yet staying within shouting distance. The tension was palpable, a heavy weight pressing on their shoulders, matched only by the physical exhaustion of the long march through the snow. Hours passed with minimal contact, but the air remained thick with anticipation. The Americans knew the Germans preferred hit-and-run tactics in the forest, striking quickly before melting back into the trees. Suddenly, a distant crack echoed through the forest. A rifle shot, precise and deliberate. Harris's squad dropped to the ground instinctively, rifles raised, eyes searching the shadows. Another shot followed, closer this time, cutting through the silence like a blade. The men returned fire cautiously, aiming where they estimated the shots had originated. Snow erupted in puffs around them, tiny explosions of white that marked the enemy's presence. Every shot was measured, every movement deliberate, the soldiers fully aware that a single wrong move could expose them to a deadly ambush. By midday, the fighting intensified. The forest became a maze of smoke and snow, obscuring sight lines and muffling sounds. Harris's squad encountered a small German detachment attempting to flank them. Close-quarters combat erupted, the sharp cracks of rifles mixing with the dull thuds of men colliding, the occasional hiss of grenades as they detonated in the snow. Harris moved with precision, directing his men to hold the line while keeping communication open. The enemy was relentless, their experience in forest warfare evident, but the Americans were equally determined. After what seemed like hours, the Germans began to retreat, leaving behind a trail of discarded equipment and the faint smell of gunpowder in the crisp air. Exhausted but undeterred, Harris's men advanced cautiously, checking each clearing and hollow. They found evidence of previous skirmishes, torn uniforms, spent cartridges, and frozen footprints that told a story of desperation and struggle. The forest, once silent and pristine, now bore the marks of human conflict, a reminder of the relentless advance of war even in the most isolated landscapes. Harris paused at a ridge, looking down at a frozen stream that cut through the trees like a silver scar. He knew the Germans could be lying in wait beyond, using the natural terrain to their advantage. He signaled for a brief halt, allowing his squad to regroup and catch their breath. The snow was deep, the cold unyielding, but morale remained surprisingly high. The men had survived the initial encounters and were determined to push forward. As afternoon approached, the squad reached the outskirts of a small village partially concealed by the forest. Smoke rose from a chimney, the faint aroma of burning wood carrying on the wind. The village appeared abandoned, but Harris knew better than to trust appearances. The Germans often used villages as temporary strongpoints, fortifying positions quickly before disappearing into the forest again. The squad moved tactically, clearing houses room by room, every corner a potential threat. Inside, the cold was biting, the wooden floors creaking under their boots. They found signs of hurried evacuation, overturned furniture, half-packed belongings, and crude barricades hastily thrown together. The village was quiet now, but the tension remained. Harris signaled the men to set up a perimeter, knowing the Germans might return with reinforcements. Night fell quickly, the forest swallowing the weak light of dusk. The squad huddled around a small fire, sharing rations and taking turns keeping watch. The cold was relentless, penetrating even their thickest coats, but the men were alert, listening for the slightest disturbance. Harris reviewed the day's movements, planning for the next stage of the operation. The Ardennes had proven to be a deadly and unforgiving environment, demanding constant vigilance, strategic thinking, and unwavering courage. He knew the coming days would test every ounce of their training and endurance. Yet, despite the hardships, there was a shared sense of purpose, a quiet determination that bound the men together in the face of overwhelming adversity. By midnight, the forest was silent again, snow falling softly on the trees, masking the scars of battle. Harris's squad remained alert, eyes scanning the darkness, ready for whatever the dawn would bring. Each man knew the stakes. Survival depended on precision, coordination, and the courage to act when the moment demanded. In the frozen depths of the Ardennes, amid the whispering trees and unyielding snow, the Americans held their ground, their resolve as unbreakable as the ice that coated the forest floor. The night stretched on, and though the immediate threat had passed, the war around them continued, relentless and unforgiving, a test of will and endurance that would define the men who endured it.